Hello there, ATSEVS533 students. Dr. John Schrage here, and we're continuing forward in our fourth module of the course, the main chunk of which is about things that we can do about global warming. Now, just real quick so we can kind of get a sense of where we're going with that, I don't want to go into details of market-oriented solutions towards phasing out greenhouse gases. That's a very important topic in the subject of climate change mitigation and so on. On the other hand, frankly, you probably have courses in your curriculum in environmental sciences where you can learn better about that than you would from me. Okay? We're going to talk more about the physics of such things and the technologies that are available and so on. I mean, this is a course in physical climatology. As it happens, I've recently was kind of interested from some things I came across online. I want to talk to you just for a moment about the background of these slides in this presentation. I got interested in the very direct impacts of global change on people, particularly right at the coast, just as something interesting to be reading before I go to bed apparently at night. And I came across the very interesting case of this island that's in the background here. This is Santa Cruz del Izolte. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but this is an island off the coast of Colombia, and it is reportedly the most densely populated island on Earth. Now, keep in mind it's very, very tiny. It has an area of only 0.12 square kilometers and only a population of 1,250. But look at that island for a moment there. This gives it the population density of over 10,000 inhabitants per square kilometer, or over 27,000 per square mile. I mean, this is far higher population density than, say, Bangladesh or anything like that. And as you're going to see as we go through these slides here, I keep on the background keeping some various ones about their situation and so on, and how they're dealing with, or not very effectively dealing with, things like the fact that the sea levels are rising or the island is sinking. It's something of a combination of both. I mean, islands are not, they go up and down too for complicated geological reasons. But anyway, I strongly encourage you to go to the websites that I list across the bottom here and look at the pictures and read about their lives, in part because, frankly, the pictures are copyrighted. But I very rarely use copyrighted pictures in our classes, but I wanted to make sure that that people kind of got a sense of, we're all sort of on a sinking little island watching the sea levels rise. We're all living in a place that's crowded, and we have to manage our resources and so on. And so I thought that was a suitable jumping off point, if you will, for our lecture that's going to be about mitigation, adaptation, and geoengineering solutions. So as we look at the poor situation here, again, I don't want to make too much of the connections between the pictures of Santa Cruz here and our situation in the global sense. To some extent, these pictures just make nice backgrounds to PowerPoint slides because they're nice and colorful. But it does bring up a point that I don't need to tell you or them or anybody else who's looking at this that we're in a whole lot of trouble with regard to the subjects of global warming. At this point in your education, you've got that figured out, okay? The exact consequences we're going to face have some measure of uncertainty, at least at local levels and so on. But that globally we're in a really serious problem is something I don't need to tell you. And it turns out that all of our options with regard to how to actually deal with this problem are kind of bad. They're not really something we're going to like very much. And the textbook that I was reading when I was coming up with this lecture kind of grouped our ways that we could respond to global warming into three categories. We could, and in practice we'll probably have to do some combination of them, but there could be mitigation strategies, adaptation strategies, and geoengineering strategies. Now, all of these words, there is some ambiguity, some different uses of the words and so on, different aspects of environmental sciences or environmental studies or something like that. So we're going to kind of make sure we even though I suspect you probably have had a class where they've talked about climate change adaptation or climate change mitigation or something like that. Let's kind of pick this apart and make sure we know how I'm using the words here from the readings. So let's talk about mitigation first. Mitigation is when we are saying, yikes, I can see this is coming our way. We have these big global warming changes. What can we do now? Particularly with regard to reduction in the emissions of greenhouse gases to prevent climate change, or at least avoid the worst of its impacts. This is certainly a very proactive kind of idea here. I mean, we could pick apart the IPAT relationship, which I've written in the slightly different form here, where it's population, affluence, energy efficiency, energy intensity, and carbon intensity. But we could pick that apart. I mean, if the left-hand side of this equation is how much carbon we're adding to the atmosphere each year, what can we do here? Well, we could take apart that P term there, population. We could say we could find a way to reduce global population. And I don't mean this in like a genocide sense. I mean, we're talking about a generations-long strategy here to reduce the birth rates over very large parts of the world. Well, some of the ways that we work to reduce birth rates are actually quite good. They're a societal good. I mean, things like elevating the status of women and improving social and financial stability and so on. But plenty of the ways in which we reduce birth rate have all kinds of moral complexity. I mean, access to abortion and contraception is not a black and white issue, okay? Especially in those cultures. I mean, it would already be there if it were a black and white issue. If it was, so this is complicated. Okay, I don't want to get into that whole debate, but this is not a simple thing to do. For that matter, we could try to reduce the world's affluence. That would certainly reduce our greenhouse gas impact, but that would take enormous cuts in our consumption of goods and services, and we like our goods and services. And frankly, a big chunk of the world's population is moving into a phase of their economic development where they will have access to more goods and services. You know, India, China, and Indonesia. These are countries that are rapidly industrializing and rapidly developing a middle class and so on. Telling people that they can't live as they have aspired for generations and so on, that's a difficult issue. That's an unlikely term for us to try to improve. Now, how about energy intensity, the amount of energy it takes to make a dollar's worth of goods and services? Can we make necessary changes to that to reduce the left-hand side of this equation? Well, I think we can and we should, but it kind of depends on how much the affluence grows. For example, if there was no increase in the gross domestic product, which is our measure of affluence, we would have to reduce the energy intensity by about 3% a year to balance out the increases in other terms like population. Just to stay where we are in terms of not to stay where we are in terms of the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, to stay where we are in terms of the amount we add each year. I mean, we're still going to hell, it's just we're not going to hell as fast, okay? No increase in the global gross domestic product is not a realistic possibility. A modest increase in the gross domestic product of 3% per year requires that we would have improvements of energy intensity of 6% per year. Well, bear in mind, we average about 1% per year not the GDP, 1% improvement in energy intensity. Okay, the reality is we are just nowhere close to this. Improvements in energy intensity need to be part of our solution. They can definitely be part of the way that we reduce that left-hand side of the IPAT relationship. But let's not kid ourselves here. We cannot reasonably expect a 6% year-on-year improvement in energy intensity. That's just not in the cards. The population improvements and the gross domestic product improvements are going to always outstrip our ability to improve energy intensity. What about carbon intensity? Could we make the necessary improvements in the carbon intensity? That is to say, how much carbon is emitted in the production of a joule of energy. You know, some joules of energy are produced carbon-free with like solar or wind or something like that, or nuclear for that matter. Other energy is produced using fossil fuels, but could we be more efficient with it so that overall the total carbon intensity of the world's economy went and improved? Well, this seems like a fruitful way we could look at this equation. We could say, if we're going to be thinking in terms of mitigating climate change, if we say, look, we can avoid the worst of it if we make changes now, looks like carbon intensity is our best bet. Okay, let's think about carbon intensity for a moment here. We're clearly going to need to switch as much as possible from the sources of energy that come from fossil fuels to sources of energy that are carbon-free, even if we don't love those carbon-free choices. Clearly, if this is the problem we're prioritizing and this is the solution that we can come up with, we can mitigate climate change through reduction of our carbon intensity, we kind of fenced ourselves in. This is our best bet. Okay? Well, I made here a list of different ways that we could talk about carbon-free energy. And they're not really in the order I want to discuss them. I rearranged these slides so many times. We're going to talk about the renewables first and then talk about nuclear and carbon sequestration in just a little bit. But clearly there's a menu, there's a nice mix, to use the jargon in the energy world, there's a nice mix of carbon-free technologies. Admittedly, all of them, as we will soon see, there's issues about. I mean, we can talk about hydroelectric. Okay, hydroelectric power is very abundant, and the technology is readily available. There's no real development costs associated with this. We've known how to make hydroelectric dams for a very long time. In practice, about 16% of the world's energy already comes from hydroelectric. Okay, it's a carbon-free technology. Not even, we're not even saying carbon neutral. It's carbon-free, but it is not without its problems here. We probably actually cannot grow our supply of hydroelectric power all that much. It turns out most of the economically viable places to build a dam already have one. There are certain parameters that a region has to meet to be a good site for a dam. Like, for example, there have to be, relatively high-sided valleys so that when you build the dam doesn't have to be 20 miles wide. For that matter, the lake doesn't have to be so wide. You want the water to back up the river, not be, spanning a county wide or something like that. There can't be a giant city right there. China did that with the Three Gorges Dam. They relocated millions and millions of people. In general, that ruins the economic viability of the plan. Turns out, the vast majority of places on Earth that have the right geography to have a dam already do. Dams have also all kinds of environmental and social problems. They're obviously a habitat disaster in important ways. There's societal costs associated with them. They silt in, they're expensive in that sense to maintain. When the water backs up to like old mines, that's a friend of mine actually, that's what his research is about, is when reservoirs behind dams back up and backfill former mines. These heavy metals leach into the water and stuff. It's all something that has to be mitigated. It's a mess. Hydroelectric dams don't have a lot of growth potential, and yeah, that's the problem. Let's try some other ones. How about solar? Oh gosh, everyone loves solar power. I love solar power. I'm trying to figure out if I can get solar power put on my roof of my house. It certainly is very abundant. There's more than enough solar energy hitting the surface of the Earth to power our society. Quantity of the power is not the issue. In fact, it isn't like you'd have to have solar panels cover everything. In fact, only a relatively small part of the area of a city would have to be covered with solar panels to completely power a city with that green part of energy. And all of the technology already exists. It is a viable question as to, can we scale up production? Do we have enough of the rare materials to do this on a grand scale? Those are all that. It kind of depends on the cost of the ores and things like that, and extraction from the ore, the raw materials. That's a complicated issue, but such things exist. But solar is not without its problems. Solar cannot be our single solution. The main problem with solar is its big problems of intermittency. Intermittency is a term that comes to us from the energy technology community that means, the source power is not always there. For example, in the case of solar, well, half the hours of the year are nighttime, and clouds make it very difficult to predict how much solar power you might get on any given day. These are all real problems that make scaling up solar to the point of it being the sole source of power for any home or community or whatever, just not really viable. Okay? It can be part of the mix of energy, but it doesn't tend to be very practical to use it as your sole source of energy. How about wind? Wind is certainly reliance on wind technology certainly could be part of the mix of solutions that we are able to come up with. That would help mitigate climate change. And the good news about wind is the technology already exists. There's not really a lot of development of something exotic like nuclear fusion or something like that. It's reasonably affordable. It's reasonably scalable. It's coming into the range of where it's cost competitive with things like coal-fired power plants and so on. The ugly reality is we can't actually get enough energy from wind to meet our energy needs. But it can be part of the mix, okay? Balancing the different sources of energy could be okay. But there is not enough energy in the world's atmosphere in the form of kinetic energy of the wind to meet our needs. Okay, even if we got all the energy out of the layer of the atmosphere where the turbines are, we couldn't meet our total energy needs. Turns out wind turbines just aren't that efficient. They don't extract energy from a very large part of the atmosphere. It does not work. Take my wind energy class and learn more about that disappointing result. But it can be a big part. We can make a big part, like we can replace particularly bad coal and dirty coal power plants with wind. Okay, we can't get enough wind energy to like charge electric cars, but we could make it part of our mix of energy. Wind power, of course, also has these intermittency problems. Obviously, the wind blows at different strengths at different times, right? Sometimes you're producing so much power, and other times you're producing vastly less, if any at all. That has to be built into the system. You can't solely power your home on wind power, or a community or something like that. You have to have it as part of a mix of energy sources. Another one of which might be biomass burning, or biomass energy. This is, of course, the business of growing crops to produce fuel. In the United States, this is primarily articulated in terms of ethanol, where particularly corn in the United States, although it can be any number of different crops, can be converted to an ethanol that then is either itself burned or is used to dilute fossil fuels. And ostensibly the idea is here that this is, well, the carbon that is in the corn came from the atmosphere, so this is ostensibly a carbon neutral technology. The truth of the matter is it's actually not all that efficient of a carbon neutral technology. The tractors and the combines and the transporting of the grains to the ethanol plant and the production of the ethanol and the distribution of ethanol to point sources like gasoline stations and so on is all really inefficient. This is not, the economics of this don't really work very well. That's the reasons why state governments subsidize ethanol so much, is that it's just not really cost effective on its own. If we really wanted to make this work, if we wanted to say, no, we're going to raise these crops in a more efficient way, and we're going to make more ethanol plants so we don't have to transport the grains as far or something like that. I mean, one could envision such a thing could be done. But the truth of the matter is, to meet our total energy needs at the present time, about 15% of the surface of the earth would be needed to be designated to raising crops that are going to just be used for fuel. That's a big chunk of the surface of the earth that would put a very high demand on these crops, and it would largely incentivize countries to cut down rainforests and so on as a way of making money. I mean, they could cut down rainforests or tear up prairie or whatever to grow more crops. It does not seem like, if we're going to try to come up with some kind of environmental solution here, a solution that encourages Brazil to cut down rainforests faster seems like a bad idea. It also puts enormous stresses on the world's food supply. Now, I know within the environmental science curriculum there are these great courses about the ethics and so on of the food supply, but so I'm going to leave it without getting just too deep in that. But clearly, this prices out the poor when it comes to high-value foods like corn and wheat and so on. I mean, a sizable chunk of the world's wheat is being used to make fuel. That's just that much less food for everybody else. And who suffers? The poor. The rich will just pay for the more expensive food. The poor will go hungry. This is all really serious complications with regard to biomass energy, and it will just never become more than a small way of balancing our needs for energy. Now, nuclear energy, that gets to be a much more complicated issue. You'll be forgiven if you have very negative ideas about nuclear energy, and you'll be forgiven if you have very positive ideas about nuclear energy. Ordinary fission-based nuclear energy, the kind of thing that is economically viable and done worldwide, including right around Omaha, is certainly a complex problem. But it certainly is carbon-free. Okay? There's no doubt about it. This, as far as carbon goes, nuclear goes pretty well. I mean, hauling nuclear fuel rods to the plant is not is a pretty efficient process. You get an enormous amount of fuel out of those rods enormous amounts of energy out of those rods for the amount of fuel it took to transport them there. This is a relatively efficient carbon-free technology, but it is full of viable concerns about safety and, of legitimate concerns like safety and accidents, or concerns about terrorism, concerns about what to do with nuclear waste, which in case you didn't know, we have no plan for. There's concerns about nuclear proliferation because traditional energy plants that use nuclear energy have produced plutonium as part of the process, and well, that's weapons. Well, it's not weapons grade when it comes out of the nuclear power plant, but it can be made into a weapons grade plutonium. All of these are, I mean, the more you rely then on nuclear power, the more plutonium there is. It removes a barrier to other countries obtaining nuclear weapons. This is all really a very serious and important consideration, but there's no doubt about it. Nuclear power is quite green, at least from a climate point of view, and it certainly can be safe. I mean, you hear horrible stories about like Fukushima or 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, but the truth of the matter is nuclear power is very, very safe. Far safer than coal and so on, in terms of it's a mature technology that has viable safeguards. Even in relatively poor countries, they can run nuclear power plants safely. There's no doubt about it, nuclear power is economically viable. It is hugely expensive to build a nuclear power plant, but over the life cycle of the plant, it makes enormous amounts of money. That's a valuable thing. So I think nuclear, even in countries that really don't want to do the nuclear thing, like in Japan, where they've largely turned against their nuclear energy industry and so on, it's going to have to be part of the mix. It's going to have to be part of how we do climate change mitigation. If we set aside those green technologies and those, whatever, the other part of the story is could we use fossil fuels, but use them in a more environmentally responsible way? And clearly the one that comes to mind is carbon capture and sequestration technology, or CSS. Capturing the carbon can be literally as in like capturing it from the atmosphere, but that's not very efficient. We're going to see a little bit about that. I think it's in the next lecture. Literally harvesting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere can be done chemically and so on, but that's not really as scalable to industrial scales very well and so on. Most of the time when we talk carbon capture and sequestration, what they mean is capturing the flue gases that come off of a coal-fired power plant and then cooling them and pressurizing them and things like that. So that's where the capture actually happens, but that's really the small part of the story. Storage or sequestering, that's the problem. See, as we talked about just a tiny bit back in, I think it was the second module of the course, what are you going to do with this carbon dioxide that's safe? It has to be permanently stored in such a way that it's not going to catastrophically escape back into the climate system where it would cause smothering and further climate change and things like that. Do you want to inject it into porous sedimentary rocks? Do you want to inject it into unminable coal beds? Coal actually absorbs carbon dioxide. If there's seams of coal that are not economically useful, like they're too narrow or they're too deep or something like that, inject carbon dioxide into them. That seems like a viable plan. There's ways similarly you can use old salt mines in such a way. And there certainly are advantages to carbon capture and sequestration technology. We shouldn't necessarily be turning up our noses at this option, especially since, okay, this is going to be an unpopular thing, but here's the deal. There's a lot of fossil fuels out there. The truth of the matter is fossil fuels are incredibly energy dense. We have a whole economy built around extracting them, refining them, distributing them, consuming them. In some ways, it makes good sense to say, let's stick with that. Let's just fix the problem that they cause. That is not... You can turn your nose up at CCS technologies if you want to, but there is some wisdom here, okay? Federal grants to study this or whatever are not a terrible idea. So mitigating climate change is certainly one strategy that we could take. I think what I wanted to illustrate to you is none of our options are great. Whether we attack the other terms in the IPAT relationship, like population, affluence, and energy intensity, or whether we focus on carbon intensity and go through all of these different ways of having renewable or carbon-free solutions, none of them are great. All of them have reasons why they didn't become the solution and we just didn't solve our problem. We'll see the other ways that we can attack our problem of global warming in just a minute. But let me ask you, I think it's 5 actually, quick questions here. Question 1, which of these is a climate change mitigation technology? Specifically, it's got to meet our definition here of mitigation. Is it A, widespread use of solar power, B, building higher seawalls to protect coastal cities, or C, increasing the amount of water available for irrigation? Those all sound like social goods to me and so on, but the question is which of those is mitigation technology? Make a choice from those 3 options, and technology might have been a bad choice of word, maybe technique. Make a choice from those 3 options and get a little feedback before you are done with this, and ready to move on to question 2, rather.